Continuing from last segment, if you recall, there was a hasty formation of a union between Egypt and Syria, which became known as the United Arab Republic. That republic, some 3 years later in 1961, breaks up. The reason for it was that it really wasn't well planned from the beginning. Nasser had hoped that there will be an Arab unity. There was no question about that. But he wanted to do this in a more systematic way rather than the frantic response by the Syrians and then the Egyptians to this unfolding crisis as a result of the coup that we were involved in. So after the formation of that union, the truth was that the Syrians and Nasser's, well, let me put it this way. The truth was that in Syrians, Nasser was actually confronted with a more radical regime, especially in the direction of pushing for Arab nationalism than was the case with Nasser himself. So on the one hand, he has a more demanding group with whom he has united. And secondly, he is also at the same time being confronted with a birth of a new nation, and that new nation is, of course, Palestine. Palestinians, along with Syrians, begin to complain to Nasser that he is simply not being tough enough, he's not leading, and he is not handling the challenge from Israel. So Nasser was really, had become trapped between increasingly assertive Palestinians and Syrians on the one hand, and also increasingly more powerful and restive enemy, Israel. So we fast forward this period from 1961, when the union between Syria and Egypt breaks, to another key moment, and that key moment really is 1967. It is a watershed year, especially for Israeli and Arab public opinion. So this critical year really began to shape the imageries and the views that these public had of each other. So with the rising Arab-Israeli tension, it is a fact that Israel at that period was becoming increasingly and genuinely afraid that there was going to be a genocide because the Arabs were so much more numerous. So out of that fear, the Israelis decide that they better act, and to do so in a preemptive manner. So what we get in 1967, therefore, is this fear on the part of the Israelis that convinces them that the best defense is offense, and they decide to preempt. The 1967 war that started as a result of Israelis' preemption was a war that in many ways was a blundered war. In other words, Israel preempted and in a matter of hours destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force. When that happened, you had a situation in which the Egyptian army had no air cover. And if you look at the topography of the region, desert, it meant that it was all over. If you couldn't give cover to your army without the Air Force, they'd be easy target. The actual fighting was over in just about 6 days. And at the end of that war, Israel was now occupying a vast swath of Egyptian territory, the Sinai Peninsula, as well as the entire part of West Bank, and of course the Golan Heights, and not to mention the city of Jerusalem, both the east and the west. The west was already under Israeli control. The East now is under their control, and from their perspective, Jerusalem is united. But the war, aside from this victory of Israel in terms of land, more than any other event up to that point, transformed the image of the two people, that is, the image that the two people had of themselves and of each other. So what you get is that with that victory, Israelis' fear of genocide is gone, and in its place, you get a sense of grandeur at the notion of having acquired or in the process of acquiring the Eretz Israel or Greater Israel. So it produced a complete change in Israeli motivation in terms of its foreign policy. Notice what I mean by a change in foreign policy motivation. If you are afraid of genocide, your thinking is defensive, your thinking is in terms of survival terms. But if you have an opportunity to regain territories that you consider yourself to belong historically to you, you will behave very differently. So Israel's foreign policy motivations after the 1967 victory was no longer really defensively motivated. It was much more opportunistically motivated, the opportunity to maintain Greater Israel. For the Arabs, it was a great shock. The defeat made them feel humiliated and demeaned. The feeling was that there is simply no hope for Arab nationalism. And that defeat meant that their entire sense of political efficacy was now at one of those lowest points. So with the change in imagery came also the change in the stereotype that each holds of its the altar of the other. So the change in Israel case was this. Israel ended up trading the barbarian stereotype. Remember, barbarian stereotype is a sense of fear that you have against the hordes, which are much larger and capability-wise are viewed as more capable, but culturally they are inferior. So the barbarian stereotype for the Israelis ended up changing to an imperial one. And remember, the imperial stereotype is a stereotype you have when you see an opportunity to impose your will, to impose your rule upon people that are viewed to be capability-wise inferior and also culturally inferior to you. For the Arabs, the change in the stereotype was in the direction of moving toward a greater anti-Semitic stereotype. Recall that anti-Semitic stereotype was a conspiratorial stereotype. They see the Jews as in a conspiratorial perspective, and they also see them as, in some ways, superior in culture than the norm that would be the typical individual in your own society. So we have this change in the two stereotypes, and those changes in the stereotype reflects the impact of 1967 defeat. So this brings me to the next topic, and that is, after the Six-Day War, Nasser obviously was very much humiliated, so he decides that he should resign. He resigns, but his army and people pour out in the street. They do not accept his resignation, and they ask him to return. So this time Nasser returns, but he is much more chastened as a result of the defeat, and now he seems determined to recover from this humiliating defeat in the hands of the Israelis. So he thus begins the process of recovering from that crushing defeat. The best way I can capture Nasser's plan to recover from his 1967 defeat is to break it down in several phases, because each phase shows how he had to modify his strategy in order to bring about his ultimate goal. So the first phase, phase 1, it's known as the Riyadh Peace Plan. The plan was named after his foreign minister, Mahmoud Riyad. The plan called for the acceptance of the reality of Israel, and in many ways was not that much different in substance from the other plans proposed later. In many ways was similar to the Camp David plan of 1978 that Nasser's successor Sadat would accept. But the problem for the Riyadh plan was that Israel, already heady by her total victory over the Arabs, was in no mood to make any concessions. She now felt much more powerful than all the Arabs combined. And what many really don't know was, in this particular phase, Nasser was willing to break ranks with the rest of the Arabs and pursue a separate bilateral peace between Egypt and Israel, provided that Israel was willing to evacuate or end their occupation of Sinai. Notice what I'm saying. In other words, the leader of Arab nationalism was willing to play the same role that his successor Anwar al-Sadat would play later in 1978. In other words, negotiate a separate peace with Israel. Also notice that what this means is that Nasser was going to do exactly what Sadat had done, and for which Sadat was labeled as a traitor to the Arab nationalist cause. I hope from this example you will now see the basis for my claim that Nasser first and foremost was an Egyptian nationalist. So I give him a ranking of 1 in terms of his attachment to Egypt, and I gave him a ranking of 1.5 in the previous segments regarding his attachment to the Arab nationalist cause. And the evidence for that was Riyadh plan. That plan really was essentially a separate peace between Egypt and Israel. But the truth of the matter was that Israel at this juncture was not interested in any peace with the Arabs, if that involved giving up the territory that they had conquered. She really did not feel any need to make any territorial concession. So therefore, it is one of those ironies of history that the rejection of Mahmoud Riyad's plan, the Riyadh's plan, by Israel preserves Nasser's credibility as the leader of Arab nationalists. So, as a leader of Arab nationalism and nationalist movement. So therefore, Israel ended up doing Nasser a favor, because had they accepted that peace, Nasser's credential as a leader of Arab nationalism would have been badly damaged. So with Israel's rejection of the Riyadh peace plan, Nasser decides to move to the next phase. So, as I point out on the slide, you will see that therefore with the Riyadh peace plan, Nasser was willing to break ranks. So let me move on to phase 2. In the phase 2, you have the idea of war of attrition as part of the next move Nasser is going to make to be able to deal with Israel. That war was designed ultimately to compel Israel to come back and accept Riyadh plan. In other words, Nasser had decided that in order to make Israel accept the Riyadh peace plan, Israel had to pay a cost for its initial refusal. And that cost was going to be in terms of a war of attrition. But question is, how would a war of attrition would force Israel to come back to accept the first proposal, that was the Riyadh peace plan? To understand that, you have to understand the assumptions that Nasser had made. First, he believed that Israel is simply too small and has limited resources to be able to survive a long, drawn-out war with Egypt. On the other hand, Egypt was able to better weather a war of attrition, especially if Egypt were to get help and financial support from the oil-rich Arab states in the Persian Gulf. So according to Nasser's plan, once he starts the war of attrition, after a while, Israel would want to stop the bleeding and would come back and accept Riyadh plan. The problem for the war of attrition scenario was this. Once he decided to start the war of attrition, Israel proved to be simply too powerful. And also Israeli response was different than what Nasser had anticipated in his scenario. He had assumed that the war of attrition would be a relatively low intensity, long, drawn out kind of a conflict that would sooner or later convince the Israelis to have an incentive to accept the peace plan. On the other hand, Israelis' modus operandi in conflict with Arabs has always been to respond with more than disproportionate force. And so once the war of attrition commenced, Israel did just that. She began bombing the Nile Valley. The conflict got really ugly. Israelis bombed the school where several children were killed. So the war of attrition really was getting to be very dangerous, and it simply did not work for Nasser. For it to work for Nasser, it would have required Israelis to come back to the peace plan. Not only that didn't happen, it began to escalate. And with that, with the commencement of the war of attrition and Israelis' disproportionate response, at this point, Egypt under Nasser made its first serious move toward the Soviet Union. They went to the Soviet Union and they said that, we need help to deal with the Israelis' powerful air force. Therefore, they bought Soviet-made SAMs, the surface-to-air missiles, and then using those missiles, they began shooting down Israeli planes. After this, with the deployment of the SAMs missile, we in the United States decided that we really should begin to enter this conflict and enter it in a more active way, because if that conflict escalates, it could drag in the superpowers. So with the deployment of the SAMs missile and the escalation of the war of attrition, we decided to enter the conflict, which brings me to the next phase, phase 3.